I'm going to talk about how we're using both Snowflake and dbt at HubSpot and how that's making us a more productive data organization. So let's jump right in. Thank you. So we're going to start by, I'm going to talk about how we handle and how we do analytics and BI at HubSpot. And I think we do it a little bit different than some orgs. So I want to get into that. And then also talk about how we're using Snowflake, how we're empowering our analysts with dbt. And then, just like everywhere else, we've done a lot of great work, but we have a lot to do. So talk about what's next for us. Next slide, please. All right. Let's start out how we're doing BI. So first, before I talk about our team structure and the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure we use, I want to talk about why empowering analysts is so important. And both Tristan and Matt spoke to this as well. At any data organization and in any organization, you typically have a lot of analysts and fewer technical resources. And in the past, that has been a blocker. Analysts had to always go to IT or go to a data engineer or some other team to get what they need technically. And we're talking about at HubSpot, how do we empower those analysts so that we're not blockers, but we're advocates and we're empowering them. And we're mainly doing this, quite honestly, because you can't scale an organization without it. HubSpot's, we're an organization of over 3,300 people. So you can imagine if we were to try to just continue to hire data engineers for every analyst, or for every couple analysts, that's just not going to be cost effective. We also have a really autonomous culture. We try to hire smart, trustworthy people, and we want to make sure they have the tools they need to get their work done. We don't want to slow them down. So we use the term empowering a lot. And in terms of using data tooling, that's what we try to do as well. The analysts are also the closest to the business problems. Whether you have a centralized data team or a decentralized one, the analysts are always the ones that are working with those in the business trying to answer questions. Data engineers, data warehouse engineers, they have the business context as well, but they're always one step removed. And that's just the way things work, right? So you want to make sure that the people who are solving the problems are able to solve those with as little help as needed. And this whole effort here, it allows our core kind of centralized BI team, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, to focus on our core infrastructure and what are those things that we can get leverage to empower the entire team and the entire organization, rather than kind of focusing on these one-off, kind of ticket-based efforts. So it's more about the strategic core infrastructure for us. Next slide, please. So real quickly, our infrastructure, like a lot of companies, we have an incredible amount of data sources that we have to bring in to our warehouse. We're a SaaS company, so it's great to see that a lot of people are using a lot of SaaS providers, but that brings with it a lot of different data sources, more so than you had even just a few years ago. And so we're using Snowflake, you can see there. It's of course why we're here today. We use the Snowflake data lake as our landing zone for everything. So we're pulling in data from, we have a lot of in-house databases, APIs, a lot of flat files sitting on S3, Kafka streams. We have some Hadoop architecture and others I haven't even listed here. And that's all landing in our data lake. And then that's where we kind of go to work with our analytics engineers, our business analysts, everyone who has access to that data traditionally has been using, we use Apache Airflow as our orchestrator. And those folks are writing SQL, to build models and get it out to Looker, which is our visualization layer. But as you'll see in the next few slides, we've recently started to migrate over to dbt. And essentially the same people are doing the same things, but with less help from us and with a lot more best practices. So next slide, please. So our team structure, with all that in mind, is a little bit different than other organizations I've worked for in the past. I've worked for some centralized BI teams and data teams, where you have all of your data engineering, your data warehousing, and your analysts under one organizational structure. Those analysts are usually, assigned to different parts of the business. That's really hard to scale at a large company. So some companies actually have a fully decentralized model where each organizational unit essentially has their own data team. There's a lot of redundancy, a lot of best practices are lost. So we've done something that is not totally unique, but new to me, which is we have a core centralized business intelligence team where we own our infrastructure, tooling, building out best practices and guidance. And we then enable what we call our analyst community, essentially all the analysts that are embedded throughout the business. It's over 175. I don't have the exact number, but it's getting up there. And they're the ones that are building most of our data models. The core team does build some of our core models that we have those other teams use. So we do have some analysts on our team, but there's the majority of our analysts are spread throughout the business. Next, please. And doing it this way, there are some trade-offs, just to be fair here. Again, scaling with a fast-growing business where you don't want to have to build out your core team. You want teams that, as they grow, they can hire and just be off and running without waiting on a centralized budget and all those kind of things that are challenging. It's also very much more accountable, right? You don't have a pool of analysts that you're saying, hey, we have 30 analysts and we're going to split it up the way we best see. As teams need it and they have a business value, they can hire, right? We can be a lot more flexible, and people can also move throughout the organization and change teams over time. One of the downsides, though, there are, if you're not careful, some of the consistency and best practices that you would get out of a centralized team where everyone is, literally on the same team and reporting to the same people. This can get lost, so it does take some work, but we do some things there. Next slide, please. And so how do we do it? Tristan spoke to the DBT community, which is awesome. It's something I've been part of for a while. And I think we are trying to do some of the same things internally, beyond just using DBT, but for data overall. So, HubSpot, like I said, we pride ourselves in the autonomy we give people. So it's less about giving directives and more about building community and getting everybody to work together and kind of, build those best practices and work, I guess, more on the same page, a little bit more organically than you would otherwise. And again, with that core team, we're investing in our infrastructure and tooling that's enabling, right? So what are our core data assets? What do we need to do and be really focused on, and then democratize the rest? And I think with DBT and Snowflake, both to Matt and Tristan's presentations, this focusing on best practices and guardrails, not gates. We think of that a lot. We use the word guardrails a lot. We don't want to put up gates for people. We want to make sure that, we have some best practices and guidance, but we're not slowing people down. And these are two of the tools that enable us to do that. Next. So I'll talk a little bit about how we're using Snowflake. Again, our core data team, we say we own Snowflake, but really everyone kind of owns different pieces of the infrastructure. So we support the overall, Snowflake instance, but as I'll get into, there's not a ton to do there, which is nice. And this is used, again, we have all of our kind of satellite, if you will, distributed analysts, the internal team. There's over 200 people using Snowflake from a development standpoint, and then thousands who are indirectly using it through Looker. So it's a core part of our business and it's used in a lot of different ways. Because of that, we have, a lot of schemas, a lot of development clones, which I'll talk about. It's not just like, the way of doing things, even 5 years ago where you had like an instance of a cloud data warehouse and everybody was on there. Maybe you had a dev instance. Maybe you had a staging instance, that was it. Right now for us, Snowflake is more of like an environment or an ecosystem. We don't really think of it as an instance because people are spinning up so many different databases. Next slide. So Matt did a great job, obviously. He knows more about the Snowflake ecosystem than I do and the architecture, but some of the core features and key features that we use specifically that enable this analyst community to thrive. Cloning warehouses it's a total game changer in the way that development is done. So an analyst being able to spin up a clone in a few minutes, they don't have to ask us. We never know unless we want, right? They're able to spin that up, start doing their development work, even bring in other analysts to their clone, work together. So it's one of those things that in the past you would have had to go, submit an IT ticket somewhere, submit a ticket to a vendor. Can you please, clone my database? Now it's a completely separate thing. This has really changed the way that when I say non-technical, I mean non-data engineers can essentially do all of this on their own with no data warehousing or data engineering experience. The dynamic warehouse scaling for us is also a big one. We have times where we have, we're closing a month, closing a accounting period, or where we have a critical backfilling job. This happens sometimes when you sign up for a new or start ingesting new data and you realize that you have a year's worth that you have to bring in from history. It's nice to be able to say, you know what, I want to scale up just for right now, run this backfill, and then scale it right back down. And again, this is something that people can do without a lot of effort, without waiting on people. And so that it's really allowed, and this is also not just for our analysts, our data engineering team makes use of this a lot, and as a way to make sure our data ingestions are running in the best possible way as well, not just our queries. And then our, being able to, I think the Snowflake credit model, when I first started using Snowflake, this was actually a bit challenging for me because I started using it when I was a consultant and going to clients and trying to help them figure out how much something was going to cost. People were very accustomed to a clear dollar figure that is set. This is what it's going to cost you to run something. In the old days, it was like a license fee. And then it was more of an hourly based fee. The Snowflake credit model is really interesting. And once you get used to it, it actually changes the way you think about what you're building and how cost effective it is. And so for us, we actually use that cost impact to work with analysts to figure out when people used to talk about expensive queries, it was always about how slow it was, right? For us, we can actually say, how much does this query cost? And we can use that to prioritize where we go back and refactor things, and where we might, change the ordering or priority of something that we run, daily or hourly. So it is a really, on the business side, it makes a lot of sense, but also on the engineering side, it's kind of changed the way people think and really allows us to focus on the things that matter. Next. And going back to the minimal administration, I can't say this enough. I mean, this is really, we don't have dedicated, no one has a title of Snowflake admin or database admin or anything like that on the team, because we don't need one. So everyone on the team can focus on building the warehouse, our data models. They don't have to worry about what's happening behind the scenes. So there's just no role that's needed. And for us, that means, everything else we do with Snowflake is anyone on the team, can kind of become empowered to do that. So scaling, again, getting those non-engineers in there and doing things that, even a couple of years ago, you had to be an engineer or a sysadmin to do. It's pretty amazing. And honestly, just some of the little things, right? Like the Snowflake web interface for us, just allows someone to jump in and start writing a query in a few minutes, rather than setting up, a bunch of stuff on their laptop and all these other things. So for us, that minimal administration saves us time, and people that once had to do that work can now do other things, like focus on our core infrastructure. Next. All right, so I'm going to talk about how we're empowering an analyst with DBT and how we're making that transition to DBT. So before DBT, and that's still at some point, because we're in the midst of a transition over, like many of you, if anyone's used Airflow, which honestly is a great tool, I use it in a lot of cases, but for data modeling and doing things like orchestrating with hundreds of analysts and hundreds and thousands of data models, you end up quickly looking like something on the right. So that's not our bag. But I think it's probably familiar to anybody who has run into this challenge. So before DBT, and still to some extent, our analysts are writing SQL queries. They're saving off scripts. They're putting those in a GitHub repo, and then those are being added to our DAG. They're having to, I say, determine dependencies manually. We've actually even had to write some custom tooling to check on dependencies and all these different things. Someone had to go add that to the Airflow DAG. As Tristan mentioned, anyone who's done a lot of analysis work, or even a little, you copy and paste a lot of SQL. That makes things hard to maintain. Something that you copied and pasted and then changed in one model, you might not on the other. So very easy for things to get out of sync. So that's kind of the world we were in. Next. And so for us, why DBT? For us, this actually, analysts came to us and said, hey, this tool is out there. This is great. We want to get there, and here's why. So they wanted to write more reusable, maintainable code. And for them, code is SQL. And very much, there are some key features of DBT that make that possible. So just, having refs where you can refer to other models instead of copying and pasting that code totally changes the way people write SQL. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's important to not just move your SQL into DBT and be done with it. Making use of these features, as Tristan touched on, it's not just a technical interface and a technical infrastructure. It is a way of doing things, and these best practices are important. But for us also, those best practices are a lot easier when you're in DBT than just writing SQL scripts and telling people that they have to follow certain ways of doing things, because once you get into DBT, it's actually easier if you do it the right way, and harder to do it the wrong way, I find. So, our organization of our schemas, breaking down models into smaller pieces, before analysts were incentivized to have fewer models, right? Because the more they had, the more complex the DAG is in Airflow, the more times they're copy pasting code. And so you get really, long, crazy queries that someone looks back on a week or two later, month or two later, have no idea what that was all about. They're hard to debug. In DBT, it's easy and clean to break them down and just tie them together. And other things like incremental models, which in the past, an analyst might not be comfortable building. They might just do a full refresh of their model every day because it's just easier, right? But that costs more, takes more time. And they would rely on, someone on the data team, if it was a more complex model. Doing things like incremental models in DBT, very easy, it's well documented, it's well understood. And those are the kind of things that now analysts can do something that they don't have to wait on us for, and they can do it the right way. Next. And so we're easing into it. As I mentioned, we're in the process of, we still have quite a bit of our data models just as SQL scripts are orchestrated on Airflow. And then we have some in DBT. So we decided not to just do a full migration, for a couple reasons. One is we have all these different teams. They are fairly autonomous. If we were to try to, push that out to everybody and force an entire migration at once, a lot of logistical challenges, things will go wrong, and it will take forever, right? I think we want to try to get some momentum and move forward. So there were some early adopters, those teams that actually advocated for DBT. So again, this wasn't the data team saying, hey, analysts, use DBT. These are analysts who are in that DBT community saying, hey, I'm trying this out. I'd love to use it. Let's do it. And we said, great. Found two teams out in the organization that wanted to be early adopters. So they got to try it out with us, and they were patient with us as we got everything up and running. It doesn't take long when you just have a couple teams that are motivated. This is something you can do in weeks, not months. So once we were up and running, we migrated they migrated their legacy models to DBT. And again, this is where it's really important, where they took the time to refactor those models. It would have happened even faster if we said, hey, just copy paste those models into DBT and get them running. But we wanted to make sure everyone took advantage of what DBT has to offer. So some refactoring was done during that time. A little extra time, but totally worth it. And then we removed those legacy models from Airflow. So over time, those Airflow DAGs get a lot less complex, and more moves to DBT as we transition. Next. Talked about this already, but there are those trade-offs. Again, go faster as you do it. Smaller teams can work out some kinks, but you do have to make sure that you're supporting multiple systems. We have Airflow orchestrating as well as DBT, so just be ready for that. And then coordinating dependencies between Airflow and DBT while you're in the middle of that. For us, it's not a big deal, the way that our teams have their dependencies more within their team, but still, it's something to be aware of. Next slide. But all that said, this is the approach we take again. It's fast. It's nice to get incremental gains and not have a 6-month project. So, I think for us, easing into it, and then over time, our other teams coming on board is the right approach. So to wrap it up, I'll talk about what's next for us. So we're going to continue to migrate to DBT. As I said, we have a lot of other teams that want to get there. We have some core models on our team that we built out that we're going to migrate in. And it's really about spreading and maintaining those best practices, right? We don't want to just get everybody in DBT for the sake of it. We want to make sure people are using it the right way, are part of that DBT community, and then build that community internally as well. And then, there's some other things that we want to migrate in. So we have a legacy testing framework that works quite well for us, but being separate from DBT doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're migrating tests to the DBT framework as well, and eventually we'll make use of everything right in DBT. Next. And finally on Snowflake, for us, it's just like DBT is pushing that boundary further out of what analysts can do and which analysts who are less technical can do more. We want to do the same with Snowflake. Continue to make sure those analysts are not just writing SQL as they once would. I think a lot of people learn SQL on a very small, simple database, like a MySQL database. And then when they move to something like Snowflake, they're not necessarily taking advantage of all the things that a highly scalable columnar database can do. So it is about education. It's about building a community internally around Snowflake, just as we do for DBT. And I think the combination of those two things is what's going to make sure our analyst community is just more empowered and more able to provide value back to HubSpot without being blocked by our data team. And that's it. Thank you.